I've always been the odd one out among my friends. It's not like we didn't get along. Hell, I consider them family. But when your buddies all work manly, dangerous jobs like logging, construction, and oil rigs, and you work in IT, the dynamic gets a little interesting. I've gotten used to the ribbing over the years. It's all in good fun. I call them knuckle-dragging Neanderthals, and they call me a button-pushing nerd. It balances out. We've been close since high school, and somehow, despite our completely different paths in life, we've stayed in touch. It was one of those rare nights when we were all back in our hometown, crammed into our favorite dive bar. Beers in hand, we were catching up and swapping stories, the kind that make you laugh, gasp, or sometimes just stare in silence. The stories started light-hearted, but after a few rounds the tone shifted. Someone mentioned a deadly accident on their oil rig, how 3 men died in an explosion that shook the platform like a thunderclap. Another talked about a gruesome incident involving a logging line that tore a co-worker's arm clean off. They went into graphic detail about the panic, the blood, and the sheer helplessness of waiting for a helicopter that came far too late. I sat quietly listening. My friends had stories drenched in sweat, grit, and real, tangible danger. What could I say? Oh, I once spent 3 hours debugging a server failure. That's hardly going to impress a group of guys who've had to pull someone out from under a collapsed beam. But as the conversation went on, I couldn't shake a memory I'd buried deep and locked away because telling it feels like pulling the pin on a grenade. But there it was, clawing its way to the surface, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. The thing is, I have a story too. It's just different. I hadn't told anyone before, not even my closest friends. Some things don't feel like they should be spoken aloud, like they'll become more real if you give them voice. But that night, maybe it was the beer, or maybe it was the need to prove I wasn't some fragile outsider, I decided to tell them. I took a deep breath and let the words spill out. I work from home, I began, on 30 acres of land about 10 miles outside a small college town in Alaska. It's peaceful, quiet, surrounded by forest on all sides. My property butts up against tribal land on one side and the university campus on the other. I paused, noticing how their faces softened with curiosity. The image of solitude in the wilderness must have appealed to them in some way, like I wasn't such an outlier after all. The college is small, I continued, just a few hundred students. It's the heart of the town, though, and the campus stretches out into the forest, which they use for research and art installations. The tribe manages the trails like park rangers, keeping an eye on everything. They take the woods seriously, and after what happened to me, I think I understand why. The words came easier now, like cracking open a dam. I was out in my backyard one summer afternoon, I said. Bright, sunny, the kind of day that makes you forget winter exists. I was watering my garden, a set of raised beds near the tree line about 200 yards from my house. That's when I heard it, the sound. I leaned forward slightly, gripping my beer bottle tighter. It sounded like someone talking, but not in a way that made any sense. Like a bad cell phone connection, garbled and static-filled, where you can't make out the words, but you know they're supposed to be words. It was coming from the trees, maybe a few 100 feet in. I just stood there, hose in hand, listening, curious, but not scared. Not yet. My friends exchanged glances, and I could tell they weren't laughing anymore. It lasted maybe 30 seconds, then just stopped. No fading, no rustling of leaves or snapping branches. Just silence. I turned off the hose and strained to hear, but there was nothing. I shrugged it off as something weird but harmless. Maybe some hiker with a broken speaker or a college kid messing around. It didn't even register as strange until later. I took a swig of beer, the bitter taste grounding me as I relived the memory. A couple weeks later, I was hiking one of the trails I'd started on the back edge of my property. It was overgrown, but I liked the challenge. I was a few miles in, enjoying the shade and the cool breeze, when I heard it again. The same garbled sound, like broken speech, far off in the woods. This time, though, the forest around me went silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, just that distorted voice in the distance. I froze. My heart was pounding, but I told myself it was nothing, just a weird echo or some animal. Still, I turned back toward the trailhead, walking as casually as I could. I didn't want to spook whatever was out there or myself. The whole way back, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The bar felt quieter now. Even the clinking of glasses seemed muted. My voice dropped as I continued. I decided I needed answers, so I called the university's forestry department. Turns out, they'd set up speakers throughout the forest as part of some art project. Students recorded poems that would play on loops, blending nature with spoken word or something like that. They were solar-powered and waterproof, but over time, the connections failed. The dean told me they'd discontinued the project after complaints from the local tribe. Apparently the tribe said the speakers disturbed the forest in ways they didn't like. I let that sink in before adding, "The dean thought they'd removed all the speakers, but I must have stumbled across one they'd missed. Case closed, right?" I laughed bitterly. Not even close. I didn't think much about the speakers after that, at least not until the next summer. The snow had melted, and I decided to go on an overnight camping trip along that same trail. I packed my gear, set out early, and spent the day hiking. It was perfect. The sun filtering through the trees, the smell of pine, the crunch of dirt under my boots. I almost forgot about the weirdness from the year before. I set up camp near a clearing a few hours in. After pitching my tent and eating a quick dinner, I had some time to kill, so I decided to explore a bit further. I found a narrow offshoot trail leading uphill and followed it, hoping for a good view of the valley. That's when I heard the voice again, not garbled this time, clear. A woman's voice, soft and melodic, reading poetry. My friends shifted in their seats, the unease growing in their expressions. It was coming from another speaker, I explained. The dean must have missed more than one. I was about to turn back when I heard something else. A second voice, deeper, warbling, like someone mimicking speech but getting all the tones wrong. It sounded wrong, like it was mocking the woman's voice. I froze, and for a second I saw something in the brush, just a glimpse of a hand. I paused, letting the weight of that word settle. It wasn't a normal hand, it was too long, too thin, with joints that bent the wrong way. I didn't think, I just ran. I sprinted back to camp, heart pounding, lungs burning. When I got there, I stopped dead in my tracks. The forest was silent again, unnaturally so. It was like the air itself had stopped moving, like the whole world was holding its breath. I stood there, frozen, every instinct screaming at me to stay still. And then I felt it. Something watching me. Not the way a person watches, but the way a predator examines prey. Calculating, deciding. It felt like hours, but it was probably only seconds. Eventually the feeling passed, and the forest exhaled. The sounds returned, birds chirping, leaves rustling, and I bolted. I didn't even bother packing my tent. I left everything behind and ran until I made it back to my house. I leaned forward over my beer, my voice dropping even lower as I continued. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by my window, staring out at the tree line behind my house. Every creak, every gust of wind sent my nerves into overdrive. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just my imagination. Or maybe some strange animal I'd never seen before. But deep down I knew better. That thing, whatever it was no animal. It was something wrong. I stayed up until the sun rose, and when it did, I felt a little safer. You know how daylight makes everything seem less scary? I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it really was some strange animal with a deformed paw, or a trick of the light, or even just my overactive imagination playing games with me. But the image of that hand, those long, crooked fingers, it stuck with me. I couldn't shake it. And I couldn't shake the feeling that it hadn't just stumbled across me. It had found me. It knew I was there. One of my friends shifted uncomfortably, his glass catching the light as he rotated it in his hands. Another stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes, like he wasn't sure whether to laugh or believe me. I sighed and leaned back in my chair. For the next week, I couldn't stop thinking about it, I went on. Every time I stepped outside, I felt like I was being watched. But nothing else happened. No strange noises, no movement in the woods. No sign of that thing. I started to think maybe it was over. Maybe whatever I saw had left. Or maybe it never existed in the first place. I told myself I'd just had a bad scare, that it was no different than getting spooked by a shadow in a dark room. I hesitated, taking a long sip of beer. But then the dreams started. They weren't nightmares exactly, I explained, but they were unsettling. I dreamed that I was back in the woods, standing on the trail. Everything was quiet, unnaturally quiet, just like it had been that day. And then I'd hear the voice, that warbling, distorted voice echoing through the trees. It never said anything coherent, but I could feel it trying to, like it was learning, like it was trying to speak to me. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding like I'd just run a marathon. But the worst part wasn't the dreams themselves, it was what came after. Every time I woke up from one of those dreams, I'd have this overwhelming sense of dread, like something terrible was about to happen, like I wasn't alone. I paused, staring into my glass. One night, I woke up and swore I heard footsteps outside my window. Slow, deliberate footsteps, crunching in the gravel. I grabbed the nearest thing I could use as a weapon, a baseball bat I kept under my bed, and crept to the window. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the bat. I peeked through the curtains, expecting to see, I don't even know what, but there was nothing. Just the moonlight on the grass and the tree line beyond. I took another sip of beer, my throat dry. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I just sat there in the dark, holding that bat and waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. Eventually, the sun came up, and I felt like an idiot. I told myself I'd imagined the whole thing, but deep down I knew I hadn't. It was a couple of days later when things took a turn, I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. I decided to go back to the woods, not to the same trail, but to another one, further away. I wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't scared, that whatever I'd seen was just a one-off incident. So I grabbed my gear and headed out. I spent most of the morning hiking, and for a while, it was fine. The forest was alive with the sound of birds and rustling leaves, and the sun filtered through the trees in golden shafts of light. It was beautiful, peaceful, but the further I went, the quieter it got. The birds stopped chirping, the wind stopped blowing, even the sound of my own footsteps seemed muffled. And then I heard it. I leaned forward, my voice barely above a whisper. That same garbled voice, warbling and distorted like someone trying to mimic speech but getting it all wrong. It was coming from somewhere ahead of me, deeper in the woods, and this time it wasn't alone. There was another voice, softer but just as wrong, echoing alongside it. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I knew I should turn back, but I couldn't. I had to know what was making those sounds. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. I crept forward as quietly as I could until I reached a clearing. And that's when I saw them. There were 3 of them standing in the clearing. At first I thought they were people. Their shapes were human enough. 2 adults and a child, all facing away from me. But the longer I looked, the more I realized something was off. Their proportions were wrong. Too tall, too thin, their limbs bending at strange angles, and their heads, God, their heads. I shuddered, gripping the table. They were misshapen, like someone had tried to sculpt a human face out of clay and then melted it. Their eyes were too large, their mouths too wide, their skin stretched too tight over their skulls. And they were moving jerky, unnatural movements like puppets on tangled strings. The voices were coming from them. That garbled, distorted speech like they were trying to talk but didn't know how. They didn't notice me at first. They just stood there, swaying slightly, their heads tilting back and forth as they spoke. I don't know what I was thinking, but I reached for my phone. I wanted to record them, to have proof of what I'd seen. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it, but I managed to hit record. I was just about to hit the button when one of them turned around. It looked right at me, I said, my voice trembling. Its eyes locked on mine, and for a moment it just stared. And then it smiled. Its mouth stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged, mismatched teeth. And that's when it moved. It didn't run, it lurched, like a marionette being yanked forward. The other 2 followed, their movements just as unnatural. They were fast, faster than anything I'd ever seen, and they were coming straight for me. I didn't think. I just turned and ran. I could hear them behind me, their voices echoing through the trees, getting closer and closer. My legs were burning. My lungs felt like they were on fire, but I didn't dare stop. I didn't even look back. I just kept running, praying that I'd make it out alive. I don't know how I made it back to my property, I admitted, my voice hoarse. I don't even remember most of the run, it's all a blur, but somehow I got there. I stumbled into my house, locked the doors, and collapsed on the floor, gasping for air. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces. I looked around at my friends, their faces pale and serious. I called the university the next day, told them about the speakers and what I'd seen. They didn't believe me, of course. They said it was probably just some pranksters messing with me. But I know what I saw, and I know it wasn't human. Ever since that day, I've stayed out of the woods, I said, finishing my beer. I don't go hiking anymore. I don't even go near the tree line. I don't know what those things were, but I know they're still out there, and I know they're watching. I leaned back in my chair, my heart pounding as I relived the memory. My friends were silent, their eyes wide with disbelief and fear. Finally, one of them spoke. "You're serious, aren't you?" I nodded, my expression grim. "Dead serious. And if you're smart, you'll stay out of those woods too." I sat in silence for a long moment, letting the weight of the story hang in the air. My friends, usually full of jokes and banter, were uncharacteristically quiet. Even Danny, the loudest of the bunch, had nothing to say. I could see it in their eyes. They wanted to believe it was all some elaborate story, a drunken fabrication designed to entertain, but there was something in the way I told it, something in the raw, unfiltered fear in my voice, that made it impossible to dismiss. Finally, one of them broke the silence. "So, what happened after that? Did they ever, come back?" I shook my head slowly, my hands clasped tightly around the empty glass in front of me. "No, at least not that I've seen, but every now and then I get this feeling, like something's watching me. I'll be sitting at my desk, working, and suddenly I'll feel this presence, or I'll be walking to my car and catch movement out of the corner of my eye. But when I turn, there's nothing there. It's not all the time, but enough to keep me on edge." I looked at each of them, my voice dropping lower. "I haven't been back to that trail since it happened. I can't, and I sure as hell don't camp anymore. But sometimes I wonder, was that it? Were those the only ones out there? Or are there more? More of those things, wandering the woods, waiting to find someone else to mimic." Their silence was deafening. I could tell none of them wanted to ask the next question. But Danny, brave, or maybe just foolish, finally leaned forward and said it. "Do you think they're still out there in the woods?" I let out a long sigh, staring into the middle distance. Yeah, I do. And I don't think they're going anywhere. I think they're a part of this place, like the trees and the rivers and the mountains. They've always been here, and they always will be. Most people will never see them, never even know they exist. But every so often, someone gets too close. Someone stumbles into their path like I did. And if they're lucky, they get away. Danny swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. And if they're not lucky, I didn't answer. I didn't have to. We paid our tab in silence. None of us wanted another round knot after that. As we left the bar, the cool Alaskan night wrapped around us, the stars hanging low and bright in the sky. The air smelled fresh and clean, but it did nothing to ease the tension that had settled over us like a heavy blanket. Danny clapped me on the shoulder as we walked to our cars. "Hey, man," he said, trying to force a grin. "You should turn that story into a book or something. It'd make a great horror movie." I chuckled softly, but there was no humor in it. "Yeah, maybe. But we both knew I wouldn't. Putting it down on paper would make it too real. It would bring it back to life, like breathing on embers that were just beginning to cool. No, I would keep it where it belonged, in the dark corners of my mind, locked away, like the cage of a dangerous animal." "Take care, man," Danny said as he opened his truck door. "And, stay out of the woods, yeah?" I nodded. "You too." I watched as they all drove off, their taillights fading into the darkness one by one. And then I was alone. I got into my car and sat there for a moment, staring out at the tree line in the distance. My headlights cut through the night, casting long shadows that danced and flickered with every gust of wind. For a brief moment I thought I saw something move, just a flicker of motion between the trees. But when I blinked, it was gone. Just my imagination, I muttered to myself, gripping the steering wheel tighter. But the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and my gut twisted with that all-too-familiar feeling of being watched. I took a deep breath, started the car, and drove home. That night, I sat by my window again, staring out at the woods that bordered my property. The moonlight bathed the trees in silver, and everything was still and quiet. Too quiet. I don't know if I'll ever feel safe again. Not truly. I don't know if I'll ever walk into those woods without looking over my shoulder, without listening for that warbling, distorted voice. But one thing I do know is this: there are things out there we were never meant to understand. Things older than us, stranger than us. They don't fit into our neat little world, with its rules and logic and science. There's something else entirely. And if you're smart, if you value your life, you'll stay out of their way. Because if you don't, you might not make it back. A week after that night at the bar, Danny called me. He said he'd been thinking about my story, and against his better judgment, he'd decided to go hiking near my property. Just to check things out, he said. I told him not to, begged him to stay away, but he just laughed it off. 2 days later, his truck was found abandoned at a trailhead near my property. His phone, wallet, and gear were still inside, but there was no sign of him. Search and rescue teams combed the area for days, but they found nothing. No footprints, no trail, no body, just silence. And now every time I sit by my window staring out at the woods, I wonder if he's still out there somewhere, if he's alive, or if something else is wearing his face.